Good evening, I'm Dan Lothian, and welcome to The State of Race, Voter Suppression, a partnership with the NAACP Boston branch, the Boston Globe, and World Channel. Tonight we'll examine why this moment in time is critical in the fight for voting rights, especially for people of color. And we'll take a closer look at the future of H.R. 1, the most significant voter rights legislation in more than 50 years. We'll also take a virtual tour behind prison walls to hear from a man convicted of murder who believes he should have the right to vote. But first, to understand where we are when it comes to the black vote, you must know where we've been. Even after the 13th Amendment freed blacks from slavery, they were not given the most basic American right, the right to vote.
That did come with the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. But it only applied to men, and even so, many southern states pushed back with poll taxes and literacy requirements that discouraged the black vote. Ironically, as a result of voter oppression tactics, the number of black voters grew fewer in states like Mississippi. While 6% of black men were registered to vote in 1892, that number shrunk to a mere 1% by 1960. Then, a signature moment in the history of the black vote. In 1965, a young John Lewis, with 600 others at his side, called for equal voting rights while marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. They were bludgeoned and left for dead by state troopers. Bloody Sunday, as it is called, forced the country's hand. President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act just 5 months later, and by 1969, 61% of black voters were participating in elections. There was progress over time, a record black turnout for the historic election of our country's first black president, Barack Obama. In 2012, more blacks than whites turned out to vote in the presidential election. Then, again, a major setback in 2013. The Supreme Court of the United States, in a 5-4 decision, invalidated a key part of the Voting Rights Act, the part that kept individual states from making changes to their voting laws. Immediately, some states began to roll back their laws.
And so the pendulum began to swing in the opposite direction. And now it's no coincidence that as we embrace a racial reckoning in this country, we are also in a full-on fight over black Americans' right to vote. Does voter suppression even exist if you can't see it in your community? Joining us for tonight's discussion are Myrna Pérez, Director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Program, Cheryl Clyburn Crawford, Executive Director of MassVOTE, and also the second Vice President of the NAACP Boston branch, and Greg Lee, Senior Assistant Managing Editor of Talent and Community for the Boston Globe. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Let's start here with looking at how we got to this point. The black vote is in jeopardy once again. And the question is, how did we get here? And is this really significant? Myrna, let's start with you, and I'd love the rest of you to join as well. How do we get to this point?
We got to this point because there are some people in this country that have a lot of anxiety over the browning of America. They are seeing changing political winds. They are seeing changing demographics. They are seeing the tactics that they have been using for decades to make themselves inhospitable to voters of color. And they're seeing the writing on the wall. And rather than compete for votes, they are trying to manipulate and change the rules of the game so that people who will not vote for them have a hard time voting. And we are in a really critical moment because, as you mentioned, we are facing a reckoning in this country for things that we have done and things that we have left undone. And we are not going to get ourselves out of the challenges of this moment if we do not leverage the talents and experiences of all of us, including those that are closest to the pain. And this voter suppression, where it's silencing or attempting to silence the voices of communities of color, is foolish. It is foolish public policy because we're not going to get to the right answers and we're not going to move forward, in addition to the fact that it's illegal and immoral in many instances.
And Cheryl, to you as well, the same question. How do you see us getting to this point?
I see us, to best understand why voter suppression has proven so prevalent as of late, especially in Black communities. I just think, we heard a little bit of it in the video. We have to go back to 2013 when the United States Supreme Court considered the case, Shelby versus Holden. And in that case, when they directly eviscerated the law, right? Like Section 4, which was designated specifically the voting districts in the country that had a history of implementing racist voting policies. And then Section 5 for them, which provided the federal government the oversight to prevent these voting districts from implementing discriminatory voting principle policies. When they struck those things down, claiming that the districts in the federal court government reviewed were out of date and unreliable, brought about laws like voter ID, right, and voter roll purging, they've risen dramatically all over the country. In addition, the burden to prove discriminatory voting policies is primarily on community members and advocates. But even with that roadblock, Black voters and all minority voters turned out in unprecedented fashion in 2020. But even this is spawning some backlash. Now the Supreme Court is considering Brnovich and DNC. They're thinking of eviscerating Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the standard practice and procedures. Because we have these kinds of laws being implemented or eviscerated, it's causing more states to just continue to roll back all of the steps that we've taken to move forward.
Greg, if you could jump in and maybe help us understand the significance of this moment from your point of view.
Well, at the end of the day, it's about power, it's about control, it's about fear. And the fear really was brought out when the first African-American president was elected. It's really that simple, that the fear that they know that demographics is changing around the country, demographics is changing locally and in states. And that rollback in 2013 is basically known as acknowledging that they know a lot of states are controlled, are in the hands of state legislatures, or mostly Republican, and they control the levers of elections, and how elections are governed. And that they've noticed because there's been low participation in your local elections, your state elections, which is the most important in terms of controlling what's going on with voting in your own individual states. That's why it was so huge in 2013, that rollback, because how states are now, and you see now with all the states right now with all the laws, they're trying to propose right now to roll back voting rights in those states, because a lot of those states are Republican. But it goes back to just the general fear of losing power and losing once what was they thought it was their America, which we heard over and over 4 or 5 years when they said "Make America Great Again," which really meant bring us back to the 50s and 60s, and that's what they're trying to roll back right now.
Greg, I want to stick with you here for a moment. And one of the things that we heard over the last election cycle was this term, the big lie, the idea that there was some kind of voter fraud that was running rampant during the election. What exactly is the big lie?
Well, to support his attempts to overturn the presidential election, Donald Trump constantly proclaimed that there will be massive election fraud, and that he actually won the election. But remember, during the campaign, he set up this massive rallying cry saying if he were to lose to Joe Biden, he knew cheating would be involved. So he set the stage for that. But more than 60 lawsuits were filed by Trump, and the judges looked at all of them, and there was no merit. But I think the big lie was born before the election season. This is where I believe the media played a role when it tied itself in knots over the things the president was saying were a lie or not, because of the media had a tough time reconciling the actual office of the president, where decorum is shown, and Donald Trump, who told many untruths but went unchecked. Thus, the big lie he got away with because he laid that groundwork with the many unfounded stories he shared over the years. So it just gained momentum because anything he said, he got away with it. And the big lie was the biggest one of them all.
Myrna, Greg brings up a really important point, because we've heard this conversation around amplifying, the misinformation and a lot of the things that were tossed around during the election. And do you blame the media, maybe in part, for continuing to push that narrative, just unchecked in some cases?
I think there's a lot of blame to be going around. My first blame would be to the politicians who are perpetrating it and who are legislating using it, especially when they know that it's not true, I want to be very clear. Like, we've had courts say that these reasons, these concerns about security, these concerns about fraud are pretextual, that they're not real. And the reason courts have found that is because what folks are proposing don't bear enough of a relationship to the injury or the problems that they are identifying. It's really just a cover for suppressing votes in many, many instances. And instead of leading, instead of providing the education to the public, instead of trying to find good policies, instead of trying to compete for votes, we have politicians really leaning into it and riling up their voters. I'm dealing with politicians saying, well, my voters want this because they've got concerns about security, and conveniently forgetting the fact that the reason their voters have concerns about security is because they were the ones perpetrating the misinformation and the disinformation about the insecurity. So, I think the media certainly shares some responsibility to not be repeating misinformation or disinformation. But I think the people who are perpetrating the misinformation and disinformation need to be held accountable for it. I also think the voters need to tell their politicians, we're not going to be supporting candidates that don't care about voting and don't care about whether or not our neighbors are going to be able to vote. Like, our democracy works best when it includes all of us, and we are going to make a voting issue how you legislate on voting. And I think if more voters said that, then voter suppression would be more politically toxic.
Okay, with the Trump machine driving the narrative, as we've been talking about during the 2020 election, that it was rigged, some would wonder how we got through the election challenges without a complete unraveling of the results. We talked with Stanford law professor Nate Persley, who pointed out just how narrowly we avoided a catastrophe.
There are, a sizable number of local and state election officials of both parties who are sending the signals that they can to try to shore up the legitimacy of the election. And so the profiles and courage of this past election with people like Brad Raffensperger and Gabriel Sterling in the Republican officials in Georgia and others in Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, and elsewhere, that is the cause for hope, which is the people whose lives are spent in the toiling on these issues of the machinery of democracy are trying to do whatever they can to demonstrate the fairness and legitimacy of those processes.
So we heard so much about those folks who were basically doing their job. They were being courageous. I wonder, Cheryl, when you hear something like that we got to the point where people who are doing their job were viewed as courageous, what are your thoughts?
That it's bogus. I think one of the things is that we caught them off guard in this past election. I think the past administration was already setting it up to rig the election in any way, by any way possible. What they did not expect was COVID. COVID-19 kicked in and the country turned to mail-in voting. And as a result of mail-in voting, like many of the different states already had it on their agenda, but many of them passed emergency laws, including Massachusetts, so that we can make our voters safe, right? Have them feel safe during COVID. And, they tried to dismantle the postal service. That came up, defunding the postal service. I think we really caught them off guard. They had no way to steal the election, honestly, because so many people participated in the early voting and the mail-in ballots. And so they just got caught.
Greg, you were shaking your head. You think that COVID sort of threw a wrench in nefarious plans?
COVID just changed a lot of things because remember voting, they understand voting patterns and mail-in voting was basically a tool to help, when it was actually approved to help more Republicans to actually vote. And then, mostly Democrats will vote early or during the election season. But with the convenience of what the pandemic had presented in terms of emergency voting, and it gave more people the opportunity to vote when they can vote, when they wanted to vote, based on the changes of the pandemic. So yes, the pandemic changed the game and really caught everyone off guard in terms of those who were trying to suppress the vote. And actually now you can see a lot of states are trying to roll back now to mail-in votes because they saw what happened this past election. But it's basically because the pandemic threw a wrench into their plans because it just changed the game in terms of how voting and voting access changed this past election cycle.
Of course,
Can I jump in here?
Yes,
I wanted to say, like, your original question was, how did we manage to pull off the feat that we did and how narrow? Yes, we have a lot of credit to be given to election administrators who did their job in the face of terrible pressure and horrible circumstances, but the American people really stepped up. I mean, we had people from all walks of life finding ways to contribute. We had young people signing up to be poll workers. We had celebrities lending their name. We had athletes pressuring owners to open stadiums. We had people making donations. We had people turning out voters. And we had people do that in the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic. And what that tells me is that Americans care about their right to vote. They care about it so much that they're willing to not only vote under really trying circumstances, they're willing to put their time and their treasure and their talent on the line so that their neighbors are able to have a free and fair, accessible vote. And that, to me, is some of what is so offensive about the rollback that we're seeing in the states, because Americans, irrespective of your political background, said clearly, we care about our right to vote and we are going to use it. And then what do we see these politicians doing instead? Trying to figure out ways to silence people.
And those Americans you were talking about, we saw a lot of that hard work down in Georgia during the last election. And it was really a turning point, in part because of efforts by Stacey Abrams and others to get out the black vote. Republicans lost 2 seats, tipping the balance of power in the Senate. And the state ended up voting for a Democratic president for the first time since the election of Bill Clinton in 1992. We talked recently with George Chip Greenwich, who worked with other Bostonians to help organize voter turnout there.
A lot of people in Boston and Massachusetts got on that midnight train to Georgia and came on down and helped. So that's, there were a lot of people here in the greater Boston area that jumped on down and made sure that that democracy was served.
What was it like there on the ground during the lead up to the election?
There was so much magic in the air. There were lots of people out there really working for the people. There were so many young Black women, older Black women that were in the forefront of this movement of registering voters, getting people active, and so forth. I know that the young people in Atlanta are very clear when they hear white supremacy. It brings up older memories of that their grandfather was lynched, older memories that their grandmother was not allowed to vote, older memories that they were being, family members being discriminated against, up front in your face. So these young people have real stories that are whispers. And so these young people don't play. They're about to challenge authority. They're going to use all the tools available to them: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Friends from across the country, friends from around the world that they never even met are looking to be their allies. And so it's really time for all of us to get together and put all hands on deck and to really understand that voter education, voter mobilization is the cornerstone of what this country is all about. And we need to make sure that we're all about that.
Cheryl and Greg, to you, how challenging is it to mobilize young people of color, get them really engaged in the voting process?
I don't think it's that challenging at all. Young people are quite creative. Young people want to participate. It's their future we're talking about. We already know that every great movement has been led by young people. When you look at Martin Luther King and all these other people, they were in their late teens, early 20s. Young people always lead the movement. I think they just want something to be a part of. And it's up to us as leaders and as the old heads, right, that we are able to transfer this power to our young people by empowering them and giving them the reins, by allowing them to make decisions, by bringing them to the table with us, right? Instead of having them over in the corner, they need to be at the table helping us thinking of the creative ways to reach other young people. Our young people are not apathetic. Our young people, I truly believe, want to be involved and help to make the changes that we are on the move to making right now.
And Greg, I'm wondering if things like social media, the way that young people are able to communicate with each other, if those tools help them perhaps get more engaged, participate on the front lines.
Well, I was in Atlanta. I lived in Atlanta. I actually spoke to one of Chip's classes in Atlanta, and I saw how very involved he was down there. And I saw how he got the young people engaged there. Look, social media is the equalizer because everyone has a voice with social media. And young people of all know the benefits and know how to take advantage of getting their messages out. They do a great job of communicating and mobilizing. And we saw that with Black Lives Matter. We saw that with George Floyd. We saw how involved they want to be because they feel like they need to be heard. They are unapologetic. They're frustrated. They want to see a better world, and they see what's going on plain as day because they're very bold and they're very smart, and they see what's really going on and they call it for what it is. And that's the greatest thing about our young people today, that they don't fall for the tricks and stuff. They call things for what they see and not bite their tongue, and they make sure they get involved. In Atlanta, I saw, like I said, Chip doing a tremendous job with the young people down there and how he got them mobilized. And you saw what happened in Georgia in January.
And Myrna, I'm wondering if the challenge then becomes, how do you keep these young people engaged when it's an off year, right? There's not a big event, there's not a big election that can get them excited, or just some other issue breaking out in the community. How do you keep them energized?
Well, MassVOTE certainly knows this. We need to remind folks that elections happen all the time, right? There are elections all the time, and some of these local races are going to have a bigger impact on very intimate details of your life, ranging from the quality of the school that your kid goes to what kind of air you breathe, to what kind of food you put in your body, and that we need to be participating in all of these elections. So I think what we need to do is get out of the mindset that the big election only comes every 4 years because it's your voice, and you don't want to lose it at any point in the game. And you want to be making sure that the country is leveraging your talents, your experiences, your best thinking all the time, 24/7. I think one of the biggest things that we should be doing is making the case for a free and fair election all the time. We need to make the case every day that we want a robust and participatory, inclusive democracy, and that it's up to all of us to bring that about and to save it and to protect it.
Very good point. Absolutely. Let's turn now to H.R. 1, a bill over 800 pages long that would prevent states from making it harder for Black Americans to vote. One of our viewers, Richard of Marblehead, wants to know about the nuts and bolts of voter suppression. We thought we'd let George Greenidge speak to that question from his own experience in Georgia.
They can change a polling station pretty quickly and not inform people. They can tell people that they need to have identification in order to vote. And it also could be, not actually being able to share the correct information on websites about what date the preliminary elections and the formal elections are. So they're done by many different kind of tricks and so forth. Also, how mail is used and how mail is delivered in Atlanta, it's very haphazardly. The mail system doesn't work half the time. And so I want people to realize that, that's real.
Myrna, do you, first, if you want to respond to what he just said?
There's a lot of things in H.R. 1 or the For the People Act. There's in fact going to be a hearing tomorrow in the Senate on it. What the For the People Act does is it takes most of the election problems that we've had over the last 10 decades and looks to the states for solutions and has those solutions on a nationwide scale. So it doesn't matter which state you live in, you're going to get a minimum federal floor. that states are welcome to do better in. They can always do more than that minimum federal floor, but at least we won't be seeing some of the race to the bottom that we're seeing in places like Georgia and Texas and Arizona, and we're going to start seeing in North Carolina and Florida. And it's really important that folks not be intimidated by the size. Yes, it's a big bill, but part of the beauty of HR 1 is that it is attempting to be comprehensive, because voter suppression takes many forms. And as soon as we think we're dealing with one issue, somebody's going to invent something else. I have to tell you, my team, we track the voting legislation across the country, and some of the creative, shall I say, things that people come up with to suppress the votes are not things that normal people would have conceived of, because they're so outlandish and they're so crazy.
What are some of those things? Like what?
Well, there's a bill in Georgia that would make it illegal to provide like snacks and water to people that are standing in line. There's a bill in Texas that would allow those poll watchers, remember those people in 2010 that were harassing voters of color in Harris County? It would allow them to take pictures and videos, and would make it hard for election administrators to eject them. Just stuff that just, another favorite of mine in Texas is that they're talking about demanding documentary proof of a disability before you can claim a disability exception for vote by mail, as if people who have the physical and mobility impairments that make them want to vote by mail can then just go to the doctor's office and get a notarized doctor form. Like, this is like crazy stuff that people are going to think of. So we need a comprehensive solution that ends this gamesmanship.
You talked about, I want to stick with you just for a moment longer here, Myrna. You talked about that people should not be scared off by 800 pages, right? What is a way to kind of break it down, make it maybe more user-friendly for the general public?
Well, certainly on our website, you could look at the annotated guide to HR 1. It's a short version. We go through all of it. We write the different chunks in it, but basically it falls into a few big pieces. There's the voting pieces. There's the pieces to get money out of politics. There's the redistrict pieces, and there's the ethics pieces. And so if you are really interested in one of them, then you look at one of those sections and you can review it. But again, on our website, you can search for the annotated guide for the People Act and and the Brennan Center, and you'll find it. And it'll give you a summary and a synopsis of what it looks like right now.
Okay, I want to move along to, we always like to get some of our viewers or those who've sent in questions earlier in this conversation. And so one of the viewers, Deborah of Brockton, asked, how do places get away with closing doors when there is still a line waiting outside to vote? Cheryl?
Well, I want to say that it's due to the leadership, right? Like, it's totally illegal, right? As long as you're in line. Here in Massachusetts, the polls open at 7, close at 8. As long as you're in line at 8 o'clock, I don't care if the line is 5 hours long, you still have the right to vote. How do you close your doors? I remember looking at the screen and saw Georgia people were knocking on the window saying, we're here, let us in. And they finally opened the door again. I don't know how they do that. I mean, that's wrong. I would imagine that it's the legislators. Like, there ought to be a law against that. You should not be, well, it is here. You cannot keep people from voting as long as they're already in line. How they did that in Georgia is because of their leadership.
And Deborah goes on to ask as well, how do they get away with arbitrarily making voting locations outside a person's town or far away from accessibility?
It's voter suppression at its best, right? Like, it's done purposely. It's not legal. And if we still had Section 4 and Section 5, you would not be able to do that kind of thing. They have not fixed those pieces of the law that they changed. So people can arbitrarily just change anything when they want to, as we saw them do in Georgia.
And they did that in Texas too, in Harris County. Remember, we had all those drop-off boxes, and there were many in Harris County. And it's so, Houston, Texas is so huge, and people were looking for those drop boxes, and the governor who had control of what to do there try to limit the number of drop boxes and make people drive all around the county to get to 1 or 2 drop boxes. And that's where it's important to federal laws to try to have a floor of a base number of actual drop boxes to have people go vote. But that's why it's important for people to vote locally to control, to stop these type of tactics, because that's what the games at play.
I have another question here from Pamela of Newton. It's for all of you. I'm sensitive to past abuses, but requiring valid IDs for voters seems like the best way to avoid voter fraud. Can't we move forward on this point? She also goes on to say that almost every legitimate voter today has a driver's license or passport, so isn't it reasonable to ask people to produce IDs before voting? So this is obviously one of those issues that stirs up probably a lot of controversy, but does she have a point here?
I think that
she is making a statistics issue and a statistics problem. It is indisputable that somewhere between 88 and 92% of Americans have the kind of strict ID that some of these places want. But that's not everyone. And we are not a democracy for some of us. We're a democracy for all of us. And we need to have measures in place that make sure that those that do not have the kind of ID that is required, because there are some of them, have a way to cast a ballot that'll count. And I think we can't move forward until people realize that we're not actually a lot safer from these kinds of IDs. The kind of fraud that voter IDs stop are extraordinarily rare. It's somebody pretending to be somebody else and showing up at the polls. That's it. And that rarely happens. And yet there's still between like 8 and 12% of Americans that aren't going to have the kind of ID that's required. So I think what we need to get past is actually assuming that everybody lives a life like mine and that what works for me works for everybody else. We need to understand that Americans are diverse and have complicated lives. I spent the first 3 months of the pandemic trying to explain largely to white progressives why we still needed polling places, because they did not understand the idea that communities of color often don't have reliable mail. They thought that everybody had like a mailbox and you put up your little flag up and the post office comes. They don't, like people that live in big buildings, people that live in rural areas, people that live in Native American tribes, like people don't live like, not everybody lives like that. And what we need to do is remember that we need to accommodate the beauty and the diversity of all Americans and make something that works for all of us, not just those that are in our own bubble.
Cheryl, I know you wanted to jump in there. Yeah, go ahead.
I did. Voter ID laws disproportionately affect people of color, young people, low-income folk. They tend to move around more, and every time you move, you need a new ID. And here in Massachusetts, that costs $25. So to have a valid ID, that means you have to put out $25 every time. So if they were giving them away, if there was a way that they were giving them away to everybody, they didn't have to pay for them, then maybe I would even I would consider it. But until that happens, I say no. We don't want voter ID laws to be implemented because it just disproportionately impacts our communities.
And Greg, you agree with this?
It's just a modern day poll tax. That's the bottom line. Not everyone can afford, as you mentioned, $25 for that or $90 or whatever it costs for a passport. Not everyone has the same life. And I think more people understand that, the better off. And there's no need for voter IDs because, like I said, it's a modern day poll tax.
I want us to circle back to our Stanford law professor, Nate Persley, with his thoughts on automatic voter registration, one of the provisions of H.R. 1.
One of the things I think few people realize in the US is that we continue to make it more difficult to vote than almost any other country in the world. And that's because we require that every American re-register each time they change their address. And because 1 out of 4 Americans moves every 2 years, all of those demographic factors that correlate with residential mobility have a depressive effect on turnout, whether people are young, whether they're poor, whether they're less likely to own a home. And so automatic voter registration says that, look, we're not going to just put the burden on the individual to go and re-register each time, but that actually the government will seek out these folks and will register them.
Myrna, what about the cries that there's fraud here, right? That this is only going to lead to greater fraud. And I know you were touching on these issues of fraud being overblown, but how would you respond to people who say that?
I would say look at the data, look at the research, and when you identify things that need to get fixed, make sure that your solutions are actually going to fix it and are going to fix it proportional to what their impact is going to be. Like, thoughtful people know that we are trying to get policy right? Like, we have to look at what we get, what we lose, how to do it, how we structure things. And we don't see that. What we see are inflammatory words and inflammatory and untrue claims, and then ridiculous policies that don't look anything like what people were telling us. And that's not good policy making, especially not when there are costs to it, like people not being able to vote.
Cheryl, I want to go back to another question from someone who sent this in earlier. Fred of Newton is asking, are there any bills proposed here in Massachusetts that would limit voting rights?
So we don't have any specific bills that we're pulling back. But one thing that we do have is the voter registration deadline. It's 20 days before an election that you must be registered to vote. That impacts our communities tremendously. I know here in Massachusetts, over 100,000 voters were unable to vote due to the voter registration deadline. What we're calling for is same-day registration that will completely support people being able, we have young people moving, people turning 18, right? At the same time, they're filling out FAFSA papers and getting ready for college, and they might just forget until that last minute. I don't think that there's no intentional fraud behind it. What we need to have in place is something that makes it more convenient and accessible for everybody to vote, particularly if you're at the polling location. That means that you really do want to vote. You run into a hiccup in some type of way that your name is spelled wrong. I know Georgia had a lot of fun with this one, with your name not being the exact same as your ID and purging the rolls, things of that nature that were totally illegal. But same-day registration would fix that. I've witnessed it in New Hampshire, smooth, seamless, and just we've been looking at this for a decade now here in Massachusetts, and we just have not been able to get it passed. That is something that is like what I call a total stopgap.
Greg, another question to you from David of Andover. He's asking, what other elements of voter suppression are evident here in Massachusetts? Or perhaps anywhere else where you've been?
Anywhere else, in people in communities of color where there's a high population area where they have fewer polling places. And this is we'll go back to the early part of the conversation, talking about how there are possible laws of trying to get rid of giving out water bottles to people standing in line. Well, people wouldn't have to stand in line a long time if you put more polling places in high density concentrated areas of population centers. So that's a way of voter suppression by trying to discourage people to vote from standing in line by not providing an ample enough voting stations to match the population centers and population sizes. So that's a very big example of that.
Right. Myrna, the House just passed H.R. 1, the most historic and expansive bill of voting rights since the Voting Rights Act. But everyone is saying it's likely dead in the Senate on arrival. What's the one thing standing in the way of it passing?
Political courage. I think some people are going to say the filibuster. I think that's part of the same thing, but I think the real answer is political courage. We need folks who recognize that our democracy is best when it includes all of us, and folks who are willing to listen to their constituents and what they're saying very clearly by turning out in record numbers that we care about voting.
Okay, I want to move on now to another important piece of this conversation that is quite controversial as well, and that is voting in prison, or people who are in prison losing their right to vote, especially those who've been obviously convicted on felonies. The answer depends on where you live. In some states, felons lose their voting rights indefinitely. In others, felons cannot vote while serving time but regain those rights after fulfilling their sentence. In Massachusetts alone, more than 8,000 people in prison are not allowed to vote. Before you jump to any conclusions on this idea, I want you to listen to the stories of Leslie Credle and Derek Washington. Leslie has served time and Derek is currently behind bars. Can you briefly tell us what landed you behind bars?
I'm currently fighting a case with murder in the first degree. Unfortunately, I've been incarcerated for 16 years now, since 2005. When I first got incarcerated, it was this fear, like, you're going to go up there and get killed, and you got these crazy people up there, and it's you won't be able to survive. But when I actually got there, I seen people just trying to struggle to survive. And a brother had passed me this book by Marcus Garvey, Philosophies and Opinions. And there was a quote in there which really struck me. The quote had read, "Intelligence rules the world while ignorance carries the burden." I've been functioning through society in total ignorance, lack of knowledge or education about my environment, the laws that brought me, that they were accusing me of violating, why they were able to keep me in an environment where I had no control over my body, no control over my movement, no control over my communication. I'm like, wow, I'm literally property of the state right now. That really sparked the motivation in me to start researching the things around me. So then voting stood out. It's like, well, I never voted in my life. So if I can't pick the people who make the laws that govern my environment, I have no power.
Leslie, if you can briefly tell us, I know you spent 5 years in prison. Can you tell us briefly how you ended up in prison, how long you've been out, and then I'd love to talk a little bit about, how you're trying to educate the public and some of the things you're pushing for.
I worked at a semi-quasi congressional organization, for 11 years. I was laid off, and I was unable to regain employment, and therefore I substituted my income with illegal means, which landed me in federal prison. During my incarceration, the conditions and what I endured led me to this work. Taking away our right to vote, basically, it's another form of disfranchisement. And so when you don't have a voice, legislators don't pay attention to you, right? So the laws that are created affect us, how long we spend in prison, or the conditions while we're in prison. We experience physical abuse, emotional abuse. So giving us the right to vote, we're able to advocate for ourselves.
What do you say to people who believe that those who have been incarcerated, have been convicted of felonies, really shouldn't have the right to vote? They've lost that right by committing crimes.
I believe, first and foremost, the best way to invest into society is to invest into the individual. By allowing me to vote will allow people in here to value the communities they're returning to. I can't participate in designing those policies. Why should I? It's going to make me more angry because I'm feeling like I had no part in designing these laws. Why should I respect them?
Myrna, I want to pick up with that question that I was asking there, where when you have this conversation with people out of the street, they'll often have that look like, well, they're in prison, right? They committed a crime. They shouldn't have a right to vote. What is your sense when people sort of view prisoners as put them away, let them serve their time, punish them, and also take away their right to vote?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I don't use words like felons to describe people. I mean, we don't describe people by a mistake that they made. We remember that people are complete and that they're human, and that so we talk about people who are returning citizens or people who are incarcerated. We don't nominalize them that way. But I think the other thing that we need to do is remember that our democracy is complicated and messy, and that there are a lot of people who have made mistakes and have been able to make important contributions to the country. And I think what is especially important is to remember that for folks who are living and working in the community and are denied the right to vote, like, there's no peniological justification for that at all, ever. Like, they're people that the criminal justice system has said we want them to reintegrate. These are people that are supposed to be living and working amongst us. And we still live in a country that where many states disenfranchise people even after they've gotten out. That is something that HR 1 would fix, at least for federal elections. It would say that everybody in the community, even if they have a criminal conviction in their past, is not going to be denied the right to vote in a federal election.
And Cheryl, I'd like you to weigh in on this issue. Should these inmates, should these people who are serving time, should they also have the right to vote?
So here's how I feel. I think I do support it. I support it. And the reason I do is because I feel like so many of our Black and brown people have been railroaded into jail, and they shouldn't even be there in the beginning. So how do we discern? How do we, how can we tell who should and who shouldn't be there forever, right? Like we're watching cases where people are on death row and are found innocent because they got the right attorney. So how do we know, right? Like for so long, the injustices have been skewed towards us. And so many people have been railroaded into jail, into prison for different reasons, and some of them falsely. So to disenfranchise everyone makes no sense. And then we still have not been able to perfect it in a way, because in Massachusetts, if you're in there for a misdemeanor, you should be able to vote. Absentee ballot. We're not even making it accessible to folks that really should be voting anyway, that we don't even have to vote upon. When you're sitting in pretrial, I think that's what it's called, pretrial, you're sitting there waiting. And how long does that take? If an election comes up, you're not able to vote, that's a problem for me. And the real problem is because we have been railroaded unjustly in many cases into prison. So we have to fix that problem.
Greg, as we're having this voter rights, debate, is this one a harder sell on the public?
Just stereotypically, yes, it's for the public. But if you use common sense, let's say when someone comes out of prison and we say we want them to be productive members of society when they return to society after being in prison, and they go out and get a job and they pay taxes. So if they're actually required to pay taxes, why can't they get their right to vote back? I mean, to me, it's common sense, but I guess in our society, common sense is really hard to really, comprehend. So if they're doing their part in society, you ask them these things, they should have all the rights that they're afforded because they're back in society, paying taxes, doing other things to be productive citizens. And whereas if you are in prison, a lot of their fates are decided by politicians with laws and bills and how much prisons are getting funded, type of activities they have, and the support they have right there, and why are they being controlled, not having opportunity to control their own fates in terms of their environment that they're living in, based on all the things that my previous guest has just explained about their conditions and being railroaded and stuff. Why can't they have a say and control in terms of voting their control and voting about their lives there in prison as well?
Finally tonight, when we cover these topics on the state of race, we always get a lot of questions from people wondering what they can do to help. Here's a few, and I'd like to take some time to discuss with all of you. Lisa of Pride's Crossing says, is there any need for Massachusetts attorney volunteers? If so, where? So asking, are there, I guess, areas where people can volunteer if they are lawyers?
On election day, we especially need attorneys, right? Like at all of the polling locations, we run along with Common Cause and the ACLU, Lawyers for Civil Rights, we run election protection for every election. And we always need attorneys to run, to answer the many calls that we get all day long about different things happening at the polling location. So there's definitely room for volunteers.
And then Shey of Salem says Donald Trump did all the voter suppression and got off free and had Republicans supporting him. Why do Republicans keep accepting this? Myrna, I know you touched on this earlier, but I'm wondering if there's more that you can add here about, is it more about some of these lawmakers just looking to stay in power and so they're playing along with this?
I mean, I don't pretend to know what's in people's hearts and minds. I think it's very hard to explain rationally and reasonably. I think it's hard to reach any other conclusion other than the fact that folks are worried about their own job security if they have a free, fair, and accessible ballot. But what I do think is the public can demonstrate that they just won't tolerate it. Like that we're not going to be voting for politicians that try to suppress the vote.
Another question from Silja of Boston. She's asking, how can we team up to support adult basic education programs to do voter education? Cheryl, and maybe Greg, you can jump on this one as well.
Absolutely. Definitely connect with us at info@massvote.org. Well, we would love to partner with you. Love to be able to provide some training, some tools, things of that nature to help educate your adult learners. But definitely info@massvote.org.
Greg?
You just go to your community or leaders in your community who specialize in, as you mentioned, mass vote. In your community, there's a lot of different places where there are voter education centers that you can actually learn your voting rights and to spread that around to your community.
Another question from Rachel of Mattapan asking, how do we mobilize people to speak out on these matters, and how would you encourage people to not lose hope in these days of struggle? Maybe Myrna, you want to start with that, and we'll come back to Cheryl.
I think you don't lose hope because folks wouldn't be trying to suppress your vote if they didn't know how powerful you were, right? Like if they didn't think that your vote mattered and how you were going to vote mattered, then they would find some other way to do their dirty work. So like, don't let them win is what I would say and what I do say.
Cheryl?
I say one great way to push back is to get involved and to volunteer with advocacy organizations. If there's an issue that you really care about, the odds are there are a handful of organizations that are working on that particular issue. Making calls, contacting legislators, marching, organizations will help you do this and help you to drive that change.
We've touched on a whole host of issues here, but I'm wondering, is there anything that we're missing here? It's, as a reporter, when you're sitting down and you're talking to someone, oftentimes that last question of, what did we not touch on here, is the one that can be the most revealing. So, Myrna, I want to start with you. Is there an area here that we need to focus our attention on more as we try to educate the public about this important issue?
I'm so glad you asked. In addition to the For the People Act, we absolutely need the public support to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. As Cheryl mentioned earlier, we unfortunately are in a position where we have less federal protections against discrimination in voting, and that is happening at the wrong time in our country's history. We need more protections against racial discrimination in voting, and this country needs to send a very strong message and speak in a clear voice that racial discrimination has no business in our elections. We need to make sure that Congress doesn't think that once it's done with the For the People Act that we don't have more work to do. We need them both, and it's overdue.
Cheryl?
I just say our main focus is to continue turning voters out, continue to build the infrastructure on the ground that it's going to take to move all of the campaigns that we're working on, whether it's a ballot question or at the polls. But we just really making sure that we continue to get people registered and that we continue to urge voters to turn out by educating them.
And to, Myrna said this earlier on about how this has to be a conversation that happens all the time, right? And that it's not just the big elections, there are local elections. But as we know, people are often often aren't paying attention or aren't as engaged unless there's something really big that gets them mobilized. So I'm wondering, what's the strategy to keep the temperature as hot as possible, right? So that this process does not lose steam.
I think having competitive races, right? Like when we talk about making sure that people stay involved, every year in Massachusetts, we have an election, whether it's presidential, state, local. Local politics is the best politics. It's the level that really affects your quality of life. I think in a place like Boston that has an open seat, right? We have our first opportunity to really elect a Black mayor. We have a Black mayor. Let me take that back. Kim Janey is our new Black mayor. First time we've ever had a female, first time we've ever had a Black person as a mayor. But that's exciting. That kind of thing is exciting. Right now we have open seats in all of our council. That's exciting to people. I just think the other thing I want to say around this is the media can have a bigger play in this. They don't, on the local level, they're not talking about the municipal elections the way they do when it's a presidential election. I think if they gave it more attention, and our legislators, our community, everybody giving our local elections more attention will keep it exciting.
Greg,
that's the area I was going to touch on, media literacy. And you just hit the hammer on the head in terms of covering our local cities. And I tell people to support media, because what's happening and when media has lost money over the years and lost funding and stuff, and what happens, we get lax civic coverage. We get lax coverage in our municipalities. We don't have people going to school board meetings anymore. We don't have people going to city hall meetings on a regular basis to provide the basic coverage that you need every day. So you got to support in a way you have to support media organizations, because they're your watchdogs to actually look at the day-to-day things and to hold government officials accountable. Because I think that the loss of reporters over the years have allowed more politicians to get away with more, because there's a lack of eyesight and lack of oversight of what they're doing. So I think there's one thing, Rob, we could have talked a little bit more about media literacy and supporting media, because media is there to help be the eyes and ears for the citizens.
And Greg, just to jump on something that Cheryl pointed out, a Black mayor in the city, how do you think that impacts young people, again, in terms of energizing them to move beyond just moments in time, but make this something that they engage with continuously?
Makes them feel that they are part of the city. They're part of something. It gives them a role model. It gives them hope. It gives them a role model to say, I can do it. I can be heard. I can be seen. And for the first time, we had 54 mayors in Boston, and all of them white males. So if you were a kid growing up in Boston, you probably never even dreamed of the possibility of becoming of the first Black mayor, the first Hispanic mayor, the first woman mayor of Boston, because you never had that role model. You never had that figure. Now we have that and seeing acting mayor, and it's possible. So having that sight will motivate young people to say, hey, I can do it too.
Okay, I'd like to thank all our outstanding panelists, Myrna Pérez, Cheryl Crawford, and Greg Lee Jr. And thanks also to our partners, the Boston Globe, World Channel, and the NAACP Boston branch. And a very big thank you to all of you who have watched and sent your comments and questions. We'll leave you with one final thought on the deadly mass shootings last week in Atlanta and this week in Boulder. An act of terror, hate, or senseless violence against any one of us is an attack on all of us. We look forward to continuing the discussion on racial inequity on May 27th with another edition of The State of Race. Thank you and good night.